All right, good afternoon. So we are the Seattle Mobility Index project team. So our team also includes 5 student fellows, Rebeca, Darius, myself, Amandalynne, and Woosub. Our team leads are from the City of Seattle's Department of Transportation. We have Steve, Alex, and Akoli. And finally, we have 2 data scientists from the eScience Institute at the University of Washington, Joe and Ryan. So how did you get here today? Did you drive and pay for street parking? Or did you take the bus? Or are you a biker who biked down the Burke-Gilman Trail to get to this building? Right now, all of your travel stories and challenges are isolated incidents. But today, the Seattle Mobility Index team brings you a standardized and comprehensive measure that captures the mobility landscape of Seattle. We define mobility as the ability to reach the destinations you need with your choice of mode both affordably and reliably. Using publicly available information, we go from mobility data to mobility indices. We use 2 main sources of data from Google Distance Matrix API and the Puget Sound Regional Council Household Travel Survey. From now on, we'll be referring to this survey as the PSRC Travel Survey. We also use data from the United States Census Bureau, the Census Employment Data, and City of Seattle's Open Data to inform our indices. To get our raw data, we queried the Google Maps API. So this provides us with both the duration and distance based on recommended routes from any starting point to an endpoint. It provides us information for all 4 modes of travel: driving, public transportation, biking, and walking. And on top of that, it also gives us estimates of your driving duration time based on estimates of traffic at any given time. Using this raw data, we calibrated and trained it using the PSRC travel survey data. This survey data includes information about 30,000 different trips that starts and ends in Seattle, logged by about 3,000 different households. What's great about this data set is that not only does it provide household attributes such as income, homeownership, race, gender, and distance, but it also provides us with trip attributes such as time, distance, mode, and the block group of both origin and destination. So our goal for this project was to measure and identify disparity in mobility to drive policy. To do this, we aim to understand mobility at a granular level, provide baseline mobility measures, and to quantify the impacts of changes in transportation system so that we can understand both the current and future gaps in mobility so we can help improve mobility equity in Seattle.
Thanks, HJ. So in order to model mobility, we'd like to create measures of where people are coming from and where they're going. Our unit of analysis for origins is the census block group, which is the smallest geographic unit for which the US Census Bureau releases data. A block group consists generally of 600 to 3,000 people, and a neighborhood can consist of multiple block groups. In Seattle, we're examining 481 block group origins. And that's a map of the block groups. For destinations, we look at a combination of local and citywide locations. Local locations include things like your local school or the closest hospital to your neighborhood, whereas citywide locations are things that are constant across the city that everyone is interested in going to, like major employment centers, public colleges, and local points of interest, like cultural centers and landmarks. We define mobility with respect to a market basket of destinations. So we create market baskets of destinations using those local and citywide locations for every block group. And every block group will have a unique market basket that combines both the local and citywide destinations. These baskets are informed by actual travel data from the PSRC survey to reflect where people are actually going to. So this map is an illustration of different market baskets for different origins in Seattle. As you can see, some of the dots are stationary. Those are the citywide locations that everyone is going to, like those major employment areas and local landmarks. And the dots that are moving around are different local destinations for every block group. The green lines represent trips that are shorter and faster, whereas the red lines and the orange lines are trips that are going to take you longer and that are longer distances. So now that we have a market basket for every block group, we can measure different mobility indices for every block group. We're looking at mode choice, affordability, and reliability. The mode choice index is a measure of the availability of modes to reach destinations in your market basket. So we look at 4 primary modes of transportation: driving in a car, using public transportation, bicycling, and walking. For every mode, we have a time threshold That is an estimate of the amount of time the average person would be willing to spend on each of these modes to get to somewhere they need to go on an everyday basis. A mode would be considered available or viable if you can get to somewhere in your market basket using that mode within or below that threshold of time. So a high score on the mode choice index means that to get to somewhere in your market basket, you have your choice of mode options. Any of these modes will get you there in a reasonable amount of time. Whereas a lower score on the mode choice index means that you're kind of limited in the modes that you have. Either you're going to be spending a very long time with some mode, or you don't have much option. So next we have an affordability index that is a measure of the relative cost to reach destinations in your market basket. So for each mode, we take into account a per mile or a per trip cost that is partly informed by the time that you'll spend on that trip. And we also have direct costs like the cost of parking when you get to your destination if you drove. We also take into account a value of travel time, $14.10 per hour, which is informed by the US Department of Transportation. So a high score on the affordability index means that you don't spend too much, relatively speaking, on your transportation costs, whereas a low score on the affordability index means that you're spending relatively more on transportation. Finally, we have a reliability index, which is a measure of the consistency in travel duration at a given time across multiple days. So in a 30-day period, I can expect to spend the same amount of time riding my bike to and from work, because on my bike, I don't get stuck in traffic unless there's something major in the construction. I can expect it to be a reliable mode. It's always going to take me maybe 25 minutes to get from home to work. But for example, if I were to take the bus from home to work every day, over a 30-day period, sometimes it's going to take me 25 minutes if the bus is right there on time and there's no traffic. There are going to be some times where it takes me 40 minutes just because I might get stuck in traffic or the bus might be running super late. So the reliability index is taking into account how many of your trips over a 30-day period fall under this 85th percentile for time duration.
Regardless of mode?
We'll take questions afterwards, thanks.
Yeah, wrong one. Similarly, the scale, a higher reliability score would correlate with more consistency in your travel duration, whereas a low score has more variability. Sorry. So for each block group, we calculate a score for each of the mobility indices. And so let's take a look at what these scores look like in Seattle. So this first map is all of the mobility scores plotted in Seattle. And what you can see here, all the mode choice scores. And to remind you, the mode choice score is the kind of a measure of the modes available to you to travel to where you need to go. So the green coloring on this map highlights a high mode choice score. So this is more available options, whereas the red and orange, that's less available options. So we can see from the map that downtown, Capitol Hill, those areas have a higher score for mode choice, whereas West Seattle, for example, has a lower score for mode choice. And because our mode choice score is built upon time thresholds, this tells us two things. One is that our citywide destinations are more centrally located, as we saw on the map earlier. So this is a place like major employment centers and public universities. So additional modes like biking and walking become feasible to get to these areas that you need to go to. Whereas as you go to the edges of Seattle, it becomes less possible to do this. Second, this tells us that the local goods and services that you may need, for example, grocery stores and pharmacies, are more accessible by various modes in the block group you're in. In the future, this could be used alongside socioeconomic maps to identify potential inequities in the availability of modes to certain populations. Next, we have our affordability map. So this is all the scores of affordability across Seattle. Again, our affordability index provides a measure of the relative cost informed by both direct costs such as transit fares and parking fees, as well as the time it takes to travel. And again, so the green indicates a higher affordability score. So downtown is cheaper to travel to where you need to go. And this could be because of you can actually bike and walk to where you need to go, which is a cheaper mode of travel than having having to drive. This is in contrast to more South Seattle, where the affordability is higher, indicated by the orange. And finally, we have our reliability index. So the reliability index provides a measure of the consistency of average travel duration over a couple of days. Now, I'm going to refrain from interpreting results for Seattle specifically, like I did for the previous two indices, and that's because this reliability index was generated from 30 days of placeholder data that was simulated from a sample of our data. But because the algorithm is in place, I can tell you what the colors would mean. So again, the red indicates a high variability. So what that means is at different times of the day, you can expect that the travel duration would vary. And this could be because of rush hour traffic or detours from construction projects, whereas the green indicates a more consistent travel duration at different times of the day. In the future, once more data is collected, this could be used to measure the impact that transportation infrastructure projects have on reliability for travel in the city. For example, the expansion of the Link Light Rail. So as you just saw, these three indices can help find trends across Seattle, but how does it help identify potential inequities in Seattle? For example, what does mobility look like for someone who lives in the University District? So I pulled up here is a zoomed in section of just the University District for the mode choice score. From this map, you can see that a resident of University District experiences, on average, more available modes of travel to where they need to go than the average Seattleite. Next, the affordability scores. Again, a resident of U District experiences, on average, better affordability for traveling than the average Seattleite, but we see some more information here. We see that the experience of residents in the University District differs from the different block groups that make it up. For example, it appears that the local goods and services are more concentrated in the left side, from the 7th Ave to 15th Ave up to 50th. This is where you'll find your grocery stores, your post office, pharmacies, the goods and services that you need to go to. Whereas residents living in other parts of the neighborhood may have to travel farther to get to this. So although a resident from University District may experience better affordability, this experience is not universal throughout the entire neighborhood. And finally, the reliability index. Again, I'm not going to make any interpretations for University District specifically, but the variation in color would suggest that the experience in terms of reliability also varies. So we just saw that these three indices paint a picture of mobility in Seattle. We are interested to see if these indices together can be used to predict something of interest. For example, could we predict if someone would choose to drive to where they need to go rather than take a different mode of transportation? So using the PSRC travel survey that not all cities have, we could predict that someone will choose to drive instead of taking a different mode of transportation 80% of the time. But what if another city wanted to find a similar measure? They wanted to predict this, but they didn't have this data. Using just our mode choice and affordability indices, we can predict the same thing with 77% accuracy, which is amazing. And we anticipate that once we add a reliability index after getting a full set of data, that this number will just increase.
Okay, thank you. So now we have three scores about choice, affordability, and reliability. Now we wanted to go one step further to understand different characteristics of travelers in Seattle. So I'll answer HJ's question. So I took a bus this morning to come here because first, I didn't have a car. Second, I live in the Northgate area. One of our members, a colleague who is sitting over there, she drove to here this morning because she lives in Kent and she has a car. So putting both of us in the same category will not be the most accurate idea to describe the travelers of Seattle. So now we are introducing the idea of travel personas to understand people with different mobility patterns and needs. Using a well-known machine learning algorithm called K-means clustering with PSRC data, we were able to identify 5 different personas that have different demographic characteristics and travel patterns. So as you can see, there are 5 people here. So I will just compare 2 personas, A and B, that have different characteristics like this. So if you can see persona A, we were able to understand that persona A people, most of them had cars, 1 or 2 cars in their household, while persona B people, some of them, actually a lot of them didn't have a car. So as you can see, 70% of their trips of persona A is driving, while persona B people usually use transit, or they walk, or they bike. This is also reflected in household income level, where persona A are mostly like wealthier, have higher income level compared to persona B. While in persona B, most of the trips are focusing going to work. So using these characteristics, we adjusted both choice and affordability indices starting from the city average that Darius showed. So some are really higher, a little higher, and some are lower compared to the city average. So we applied this to university district example. So we are only focusing on persona B here. So you can see that persona B's mode choice score is slightly higher than the baseline score of U district. And affordability is also a little higher compared to the baseline. So in this way, we were able to describe different personas and their travel patterns using affordability and mode choice scores.
Thank you, Woosub. Okay. Oh, excuse me. Thank you. Okay. So during the summer, we've developed this way to map urban mobility in Seattle. And we think that one of the more important contributions that we've made is a little bit higher level. So we've proposed essentially a new way of measuring mobility. Traditionally, mobility is measured with instruments like surveys or traffic sensors. And now we're using Google data that helps us get a granular and comprehensive way to map mobility in Seattle. So now instead of having an isolated traffic sensor in one place, we're able to have data at in a unit as small as the census block. This is also a lot cheaper and easier, which makes it scalable and reproducible. And finally, having data at this scale allows us to do more cross-domain collaboration. So for example, if we want to understand how people's mobility relates to other socioeconomic variables, we can, for example, compare how people with different levels of income might have different levels of affordability for their mobility. So here, on the x-axis, we have our affordability index, and on the y-axis, we have the average household income. So each of these points on this map represents a neighborhood in Seattle. So for example, in Capitol Hill, average income is high, and so is their mobility. On the other hand, in the university district, you have a lot of students, so average household income is lower. But we have access to a lot of transportation and goods and services. So our affordability is not too bad. But in a place like Interbay, where average income is low, and so is affordability for mobility, this might be a place for policy intervention. So this is a very rough example to show how our output might be used to better understand a bigger picture. So we've worked very hard this summer, and we've developed this tool. And as we hand it over to the Seattle Department of Transportation, there are more things that they can do. So the first thing they're going to need to do is take that placeholder data and replace it with actual data to create a real reliability index. So we've created the algorithm, and now they just need to collect data to get that set up. And we've also created a tool that's flexible. So essentially, if they wanted to add new modes of transportation like bike share, ride hail, or ride share, but yeah, they can do that easily and also collect the data from Google. And then once they have all of this, they can create a baseline with which to track changes to people's mobility in Seattle. So we visualize this tool being used by many different types of stakeholders. For example, the city of Seattle can use it to make data-informed policy decisions. Transportation researchers and policy analysts can use it to track changes of different policy interventions and programs in Seattle. So the example that we've used before is once the light rail opens, how does people's mobility landscape change? Community organizations and nonprofits can use our data to target their advocacy efforts. And finally, other cities with their own set of mobility challenges can use our model and replicate it to understand their own cities. So again, we'd like to thank the eScience Institute. We've had a wonderful summer. We've all learned a lot. We'd like to thank our data scientists and our project leads. And yeah, thank you. Are there questions?
I'll just answer the question that was brought up earlier. So for, for the reliability index, currently the data we have is only for driving data, but Amandalynne was just phrasing the question, the kind of the story that when she bikes to work, that is a reliable method of transportation for her. And we hope to, in the future, incorporate transit data, because transit and driving data are the two ones that are really dependent upon traffic. But as of now, with the Google Matrix API that we're using, we only have driving data in it.
So did you completely exclude other data, or did you count the other, like the likelihood of you taking walking or biking is that included in the factor?
So for the reliability, the way it works is we count the number of trips that are that specific mode, the driving mode that we have for this. And then we set a threshold at the 85th percentile that Amandalynne mentioned, and we essentially get a ratio of the amount of trips that fall under this threshold compared to the overall amount of driving trips. So this score is painting a picture of really this driving, which is definitely a limitation of that specific index at the moment, and we hope to have it improve as more data becomes available.
So I really appreciated seeing you explain at the very end how the affordability index could be compared against the actual median income for the census tract. I had been wondering that when you were originally presenting it. And so I'm curious if you could see in a future iteration of this, having the affordability index actually reflect the median household income of the census tract or the census block group, so that it appears in the visualization as, it's affordable for someone, for like the average or middle person for the entire city of Seattle from this location. What about the people who really live there?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done, and the way the tool is built, it allows for more things to be added. But that's kind of the whole idea, is that we can use it to go beyond just looking at how people might travel to thinking more about other implications.
I may have missed it, but did you consider parking or the availability of parking and the cost of parking that would affect the mobility?
So we did incorporate that. So with the driving mode specifically, that's when this would come into account. We have access to a very extensive parking data set from SDOT. I believe it's from SDOT. And so we were able to get by location the parking rate where you are in a region kind of around where you want to go. And we built in actually a 9-minute threshold based on a literature source. I'm forgetting the name right now, but the 9 minutes average time it takes for you to walk from your parking spot to where you need to be into the duration time per car. So that is reflected in the overall duration time plus the parking fee.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just have a small comment about the parking fee. So I'm from PSRC. So PSRC is developing a database for the parking fee. So in the future, maybe by the end of this summer or the beginning of next year, you will see a very detailed, even by block or by building, how the parking fee and garage parking, mostly focused on the CBD area in the whole region.
Awesome.
And another question that, have you ever think about overlay the accessibility between these two indexes?
Yeah, we thought about it.
Want to go for that?
So between which ones did you?
Accessibility and affordability. Because sometimes
Yeah.
I feel, some place.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So the way the index is constructed right now, the values for affordability that you see are only for viable trips. And so these are actually very closely related. I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question, but I think we could definitely think of another way to integrate it. I think, yeah.
Yeah, so because the two maps that you show in the slides, can you show that maps like affordability and accessibility map? They actually reverse each other for the whole region. Kind of. Like, I'm kind
This one or?
of getting confused about why Magnolia is just affordability is so.
Yeah. So, yeah. So Magnolia, so the big red block in Magnolia, that's like Discovery Park area. And so something that was interesting about this that we did observe going from mode choice to affordability. So as Rebeca mentioned, we are taking only the trips that fall within the time threshold set by the mode choice into account for the affordability. This allows us to differentiate with the different personas, and also like it really isn't feasible to walk from somewhere in South Seattle to UW. So like we took only into account the trips that fall in these thresholds. So for Magnolia and for somewhere like near Discovery Park where it's really red, transit and driving might be the only option, the only available mode to go somewhere. So we're calculating our affordability based on that. So there is a relationship because these scores that come from the mode choice are sort of also have some influence, and which is why we see a lot of similar trends in the centrally located areas being green, because that is where the citywide destinations are located, the major employment areas, the public universities, and so we see some correlation that way. Also, so one thing that's interesting, these block groups are geographic distinctions, but they're not always representative of where a lot of people live. So Discovery Park, for example, not so many people, I don't know if anybody lives there, or there's a block group that is pretty much just UW. And besides like some undergrads, not many people live there. So there are some important considerations to understand geographically where you are, that not every block group necessarily represents where people are living, what they're experiencing. But like as a neighborhood on the whole, made up from a bunch of block groups, you can get a better picture. I think the question right here.
We could do one last question while we're sort of transitioning.
Who has a good question?
So I love the presentation. I was very glad about the previous comment about.
Do you have the same adapter?
I can use that one, yeah.
Because like actually in Seattle, 80,000 is low income. Because
Let me get that.
median household income is 103,000 right now. Adjusting for that would be really interesting to see how much proportions block groups are contributing to transportation. I think you could really do that. One thing I was wondering in particular was, did you accommodate for topography, zoning, and speed? Because I saw that on the third map, that last slide, you had like East Lake, which is kind of like a tip. There's a tip there. You got the University Bridge, which is one speed, and then you got I-5, which is a totally different speed too. And zoning in particular, mixed use zoning, multiple lights versus residential, which is like roundabouts and all that kind of stuff. That would impact the access to speed. And that first map you had seemed like a very nice egg of like green to red kind of thing.
Yeah.
I was just curious about those accommodations.
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting point that we did not consider, but the indices were built in a way to make them very scalable, so we can add different features to them to make them more reflective of the atmosphere in Seattle. But one thing that you brought up that we did notice, so although the reliability index map was generated on placeholder data, it was based off of a small sample of the data we did have at the time. And we did notice from that simulated traffic time that it really followed the I-5 corridor. Like along the I-5 corridor is pretty yellow-green, and on the east and west, it's more red. So that was definitely an interesting observation. So putting in the additional points like you're mentioning could definitely help paint a better picture.
Could you separate I-5 from the rest of it?
That's probably possible. We have that data actually in the shapefiles. But yeah, that's something that we looked at the moment here.
Okay, I think we should probably give them a thank you.